Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are warned that this story details the accounts and names of deceased persons. Since the fateful day in 1986, when Yindjibarndi boy John Pat died in police custody, the 28th of September has been known as John Pat Day in Australia. It is a constant reminder of the oppression and injustice that the Indigenous people continue to face. His death launched the landmark Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody and exposed the fractured relationship between the justice system and First Nations people. To this day, no one has ever been found guilty of an Indigenous death in custody in Australia. Uncover the dark history of this unique country with this chapter, The Death of John Pat. This is Australian Crime Stories. The Yindjibarndi people are a proud Aboriginal nation from the Pilbara region of Western Australia, centred around the town of Roebourne. It was here, on the 31st of October 1966, that John Peter Pat was born to Mavis Pat, a Yindjibarndi woman with deep ties to the land and culture. Mavis herself grew up on Mount Florence Station, a sheep station where her parents lived and worked. At just 11 years old, she was sent to the segregated native school in Roebourne, part of a broader system designed to control and assimilate Aboriginal children. After 5 years of schooling, she would return to the station during holidays. At just 16, she was pressured under Aboriginal customary law into marrying a 36-year-old labourer, Len Wally, an arrangement made without her full consent and under the weight of tradition. Soon after, John was born. Like his mother, John spent his early childhood on the station, surrounded by bushland, traditional stories, and cultural practices. Around the age of 9, Mavis left John's father and formed a new partnership with Mick Lee, a respected figure in the community, known for his leadership and steady hand. The family moved into Roebourne, where Mick worked at the local youth centre, and Mavis became a teacher aide. Together, they led a community program that took local children into the bush, teaching them to boil a billy, make damper, and share traditional yarns blending Aboriginal heritage with station life storytelling. The family lived on what was known as the 2 Mile Reserve, a government-established Aboriginal settlement about 2 miles outside Roebourne. These reserves were created after Indigenous people were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands, with control handed over to police and the Native Welfare Department. The 2 Mile Reserve was the largest in Western Australia, home to around 300 Aboriginal residents. With no regard for cultural or linguistic differences, authorities grouped people from distinct communities together. This fueled tensions and eventually led to the reserve splitting into 2 main areas, one for the Engaluma and one for the Yindjibarndi. In 1975, when John was about 8 years old and attending the local school, the reserve was abruptly closed. Its residents were forcibly relocated to a cluster of state housing on the outskirts of town, near the Roebourne Cemetery. The move, done with minimal consultation, caused deep offence and emotional harm to the community. After leaving school, John found work as a station hand for 2 months, but soon returned to Roebourne unemployed. It was during this time that he, like many of his peers, began to drink heavily, a common response to the stress, displacement, and marginalisation experienced by Aboriginal youth. Alcohol is the most widely used psychoactive drug in Australia. However, its impact is particularly significant within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. To fully understand alcohol use among these communities, it must be considered within the broader social and historical context of colonisation, the dispossession of land and culture, and ongoing economic and social exclusion. The first meaningful responses to concerns about harmful alcohol use among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were initiated not by government but by Indigenous communities themselves. These leaders recognised that mainstream non-Indigenous responses were either absent or culturally inappropriate. It's also important to acknowledge that alcohol misuse is not exclusive to these communities. Alcohol abuse is a widespread issue that affects many Australians, including those of European descent. Tensions between Aboriginal Australians and police have deep roots in the country's history. It is sadly unsurprising that individuals like John found themselves entangled in the justice system from an early age. At just 14, he was found guilty of assaulting a police officer, and by 15, he had been convicted of the same offence once again. Throughout his adolescence, he appeared before the local magistrates' court multiple times, often on charges related to alcohol. His story reflects broader systemic issues that have led to the over-policing and criminalisation of Indigenous youth. Roebourne, where John lived, has a troubling history of mistreatment toward Aboriginal people. The town's old jail, for example, once held Indigenous prisoners from across the Pilbara, many of whom were forced to march from Karratha in chains under the brutal summer sun. Today, concerns remain. The current prison has been criticised for failing to install air conditioning in all cells, despite the extreme heat, with temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius during the summer of 2022. The town was also the site of excessive policing. In 1983, Roebourne experienced what was described as saturated policing, with officers patrolling the streets every 15 minutes. Over a span of just 89 days, police made 730 arrests, virtually all of them involving Aboriginal people. These figures highlight a disturbing pattern of racialised policing and the persistent overrepresentation of Indigenous Australians in the criminal justice system. 28th of September 1983. The date that is now known as John Pat Day. The Western Australian Police Union of Workers are holding a significant meeting at the Karratha Traffic Office, approximately 30 minutes from Roebourne. Given the importance of the meeting, it was attended by union officials from Perth, as well as around 20 police officers from across the Pilbara region. Among those present were 5 officers from Roebourne, Senior Constables Ian Armett, Stephen Bordis and Terence Hole, Sergeant John Devaney and First Class Police Aide Michael Walker. After finishing their meeting, everyone then went to Karratha Golf Club for drinks and a function arranged by the union. Meanwhile, 16-year-old John Pat was spending the afternoon with friends, drinking in a patch of bushland locals referred to as Plonk Valley, a clearing at the end of Padbury Street where it intersects with Shoal Street. He would later find himself at Victoria Hotel. As the evening wore on, some of the officers from both Roebourne and nearby Wickham decided to continue drinking before heading home. Around 8:30 p.m, the Roebourne officers, driven by Sergeant Devaney, left Karratha and made their way back to Roebourne, where they gathered at the Victoria Hotel on Padbury Street. The Wickham officers also headed to the same hotel, arriving around 9 p.m, where they drank in the top bar. When the Roebourne police arrive at the Victoria Hotel, they encounter a dispute outside between a young Aboriginal man, Ashley James, and his partner, Anne Stock. 2 officers instruct the pair to go home before entering the pub themselves. They too take their place in the top bar, but reportedly sit separate from the Wickham group, and they don't interact with one another. While drinking, the Roebourne officers notice Ashley James re-enter the hotel, this time going into the bottle shop. Senior Constable Armick briefly speaks to him, but when Hole learns that James had returned, he isn't satisfied. Hole goes outside and enters the bottle shop, confronting James. An altercation broke out between them, and at some point Hole decides to leave the bottle shop and wait outside for James, clearly not finished with their quarrel. When Ashley James leaves the bottle shop, he intends to go home, but Hole confronts him yet again and a physical fight quickly breaks out between the two. Several Aboriginal men, including John Pat, witness the fight and join the scuffle in support of James. The situation escalates quickly. In the top bar, Ahmet notices Holt's absence and goes outside to find him. Despite accounts from the night varying considerably between the police, Indigenous Australians and onlookers, there is no doubt that Ashley James, Lenny's James, John Pat, Jeffrey Lockyer and the Roebourne police officers, Ahmet, Bordus, Hole and Walker, were involved in a fight. Witnesses report a police officer, likely Ahmet, striking John Pat in the face, which caused him to fall backwards and hit his head on the pavement. Whilst Pat was on the ground, an officer kicks him in the head. Pat was then dragged to a police van, kicked again, and thrown into the vehicle like a dead kangaroo. Sergeant Devaney, who had not participated in the altercation, drove to the nearby Roebourne police station just 500 metres away to call for reinforcements. Around the same time, a Wickham police van arrived at the hotel, accompanied by Adrian DeLint, the overseer of the Victoria Hotel. As the two police vans, one from Wickham and one from Roebourne, pulled up to the hotel, the violence began to subside. During the course of the fight, several arrests were made. John Pat was the first person to be placed in the Wickham van. Peter Coppin was arrested by Bordus and was also placed in the Wickham van. Although Coppin was arrested for disorderly conduct, at the Roebourne police station a charge of hindering Ahmet, not of disorderly conduct, was preferred. Brian Munda was arrested on the charge of hindering Ahmet, and Roy Smith was arrested on a charge of hindering Hale, and they were also placed in the Wickham van. Lenny's James had been arrested for aggravated assault on Ahmet and resisting his arrest by Hole. He was the only person arrested who was placed in the Roebourne police van. After the prisoners were placed in the vans, Hole, Bordus and Ahmet returned to the top bar. Walker had gone back to the bar some time earlier. The officers variously finished off their drinks before returning to the police station. Of the 5 Aboriginal men arrested that night, John Pat was the only juvenile. All officers were off duty and out of uniform. After being transported to the Roebourne police station, Pat and the other arrested men were unloaded from the vans. Witnesses testified that officers dragged the men, including Pat, from the vans and assaulted them again on the station's pathway. Pat, now unconscious or semi-conscious, was placed in a juvenile cell and left unattended. Roughly an hour later, during a routine cell check, officers discovered that John Pat was dead. An autopsy found John Pat had suffered a fractured skull, hemorrhage and bruising and tearing of the brain. There was also a large bruise at the back of his head, and 6 on the right side of it. He had a torn aorta and 2 broken ribs. On the morning of the 29th of September, Detective Sergeant Bruce Scott, the duty officer at the Perth Criminal Investigations Branch, was informed of John Pat's death. He quickly spoke with Detective Sergeant Bartlett and read the CIB rumming sheet. Later that day, Inspector Alan Balcombe, Head of Internal Affairs, was directed to travel to Roebourne with Scott to investigate the death. Balcombe focused on internal disciplinary breaches, while Scott investigated possible criminal conduct. Although they worked as a team, Balcombe led the inquiry. Scott joined the police in 1954 and had extensive experience with the CIB and in dealing with Aboriginal people. By 1990, he had risen to Assistant Commissioner Crime. Balcombe, who retired in 1984 after 34 years of service, had led internal affairs and previously worked in the CIB for decades. Both men were experienced, and their appointments reflected the seriousness with which police viewed the investigation. Balcombe, as the lead, was described as honest and open. With limited early support from Karratha officers, Scott and Balcombe largely handled the investigation alone. Mr. Quigley, acting for the officers via a union retainer, arrived in Roebourne before the investigators. He advised that the 5 officers would not answer questions until they were informed of the allegations. Investigators believed this made interviews pointless, a belief that significantly impacted the investigation. On the 1st of October, Belcom interviewed the 5 officers. Most read prepared statements and declined further comment. Follow-up interviews on 6 and the 21st of October produced little more. Officers declined to answer questions related to new allegations raised by community members. These interviews were considered perfunctory. The investigators remained in Roebourne until the 7th of October, collecting numerous statements. However, by October, it became clear the coroner intended to start the inquest before police completed their inquiries. An inquest was commenced in Roebourne about a month after the death and ran for 21 days and heard from about a month after the death and ran for 21 days and heard from the official police version differed from the accounts given by others. The official police version one officer said that Pat had walked from the van to police lockup. One officer said that however a medical expert said this wasn't possible considering his injuries. However, a medical expert said this wasn't possible. The conclusion of the inquest found the 4 police officers and a police aide committed for trial on a charge of manslaughter. Committed for trial on a charge of manslaughter. They stood trial in the Supreme Court. They stood trial in the Supreme Court. And all of the officers refused to testify. All of the officers refused to testify. And they were all acquitted by an all-white jury. All of the officers were reinstated to duty, and their legal costs reimbursed by state government. No disciplinary action was taken against any police officer. RSCiatic, the officer's acquittal led to widespread outrage and sparked a long-term campaign calling for an investigation into the deaths of First Nations peoples whilst being detained. The Hawke government announced the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in custody on the 10th of August 1987. The Commission investigated 99 such deaths, occurring over the almost 8.5 years from the 1st of January 1980 to the 31st of May 1989. Amongst the many findings and recommendations made, the National Commissioner, Mr. Elliot Johnston, the National Commissioner, quoting his predecessor, Commissioner Muirhead, noted that in Australia, Commissioner Muirhead, First Nations people in Australia, Aborigines are 10 times more likely to die in prison than non-Aboriginal people, and 20 times more likely to die in the custody of the police. Of even more concern are the findings relating to Western Australia, the state which, despite having only the 3rd highest Aboriginal population, recorded 32 deaths over the relevant period, that is, almost 1/3 of the total number of deaths and the highest number for any state or territory. Findings indicate that in Western Australia, Aborigines are 26 times more likely to be in prison than non-Aboriginals, and 43 times more likely to be in the custody of the police. Again, both statistics are higher than that recorded for any other state or territory. The Commission made 339 recommendations aimed at addressing the systemic issues contributing to Indigenous deaths in custody, yet most have never been implemented or acted upon. In the 40-plus years since the Commission's report, over 500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have died in custody. These deaths continue at a disturbing rate, reflecting deep and ongoing failures in the justice system. Very few cases have resulted in trials, and none have led to a conviction. To date, no one in Australia has ever been found guilty over the death of an Indigenous person in custody. John Pat's story is more than a tragedy from the past. It is a reflection of the ongoing struggle for justice, accountability, and dignity for First Nations people in Australia. His death, at just 16 years old, became a symbol of a broken system, where too often Aboriginal lives are treated as expendable and justice remains out of reach. Despite a Royal Commission, hundreds of recommendations, and decades of promises, very little has changed. The cycle continues. Aboriginal men, women, and children are still dying in custody, and the justice system continues to fail them. The fact that no one has ever been held criminally responsible for an Indigenous death in custody is a damning indictment of the system itself. John Pat Day, observed every year on the 28th of September, is a time of remembrance, resistance, and renewed calls for change. It is a solemn reminder that until the lives of First Nations people are treated with the same value and protection as others, true justice will remain elusive. Miss Pat was only 14 when she learnt of her brother's death. She said at the time the apology was issued that there's no justice for my people and all people of today. My brother's life was taken. It only seems like yesterday it was taken from me, and I still wish I had my big brother here today. This is not just the story of one boy, it is the story of a nation that must reckon with its past, confront its present, and demand a better future. This has been Australian Crime Stories, The Death of John Pat. Don't forget to follow us on your listening platform for weekly episodes. You can also follow us on Instagram and TikTok for short crime videos.